Fame looks like freedom from the outside, but what if it quietly takes more than it gives? After 4 decades in the spotlight, Johnny Depp has finally admitted something he never said this clearly before. Not about movies, not about money, but about what fame slowly erased from his life. Privacy, trust, stillness, the simple ability to exist without being watched. In rare, documented interviews with outlets like Rolling Stone, his words reveal a pattern no headline ever explained. This is not gossip. This is the cost behind the legend, told through his own recorded admissions, and once you hear it, you will never look at celebrity the same way again. Fame did not arrive in Johnny Depp's life like a celebration. It arrived like a slow takeover. Before the cameras, before the contracts, before the global recognition, he was a quiet kid who wanted to play music and disappear into stories. Acting was never about being seen. It was about hiding. In a documented Rolling Stone interview, Johnny Depp openly said that he never pursued fame, and that attention made him deeply uncomfortable. This matters, because it explains everything that followed. When success came after films like A Nightmare on Elm Street and later exploded with Pirates of the Caribbean, the world saw confidence. He felt exposure. What most people miss is that fame didn't change him overnight. It changed the rules around him. Suddenly, silence became suspicious. Privacy became negotiable. Every movement carried consequences. In an interview, he admitted that he stopped trusting rooms, stopped trusting phones, and eventually stopped trusting people. Not because he wanted to be distant, but because experience trained him to be careful. When millions of eyes are watching, mistakes don't stay mistakes. They become identity. For over 40 years, Johnny Depp lived under constant interpretation. Every pause, every word, every absence was explained by someone else. He once stated in an interview that when fame reaches a certain level, your actual voice becomes the quietest one in the room. That admission is important because it shows the psychological cost, not the financial benefit. Success gave him opportunity, but it took away authorship of his own narrative. There is a moment he described, documented during a press conversation in Europe, where he realized he no longer knew who was approaching him because they liked him versus because they needed something from him. That realization doesn't happen to people outside the spotlight. Fame replaces normal social filters with constant performance. Even authenticity becomes a risk. He admitted that he lost the ability to be anonymous long before he lost peace. Walking into a bookstore, sitting at a cafe, standing in line, all became strategic decisions. He said this not as a complaint, but as a fact. Fame trains you to calculate visibility. And once you start calculating, you stop resting. Over time, this constant pressure reshaped how he interacted with the world. In interviews with Rolling Stone, he described feeling like a walking projection screen, where people placed their expectations, fantasies, and anger onto him without permission. That sentence alone reveals what fame took from him most clearly. It took his ability to be perceived as human first. Another thing fame slowly removed was stillness. Not physical stillness, but mental quiet. When your name becomes a brand, silence feels dangerous. If you are not present, someone else speaks for you. He admitted that he stayed in motion for years not because he wanted to, but because stopping felt like surrendering control of the narrative. Johnny Depp also spoke about how fame distorted time. Projects overlapped. Commitments stacked. Personal space shrank. Birthdays, relationships, and grief were often processed between schedules. In one interview, he reflected on how moments that should have been private were remembered through press cycles instead of emotions. That's not a loss people talk about, but it is one of the deepest ones. Fame also affected how he saw himself. When millions applaud you for characters, it becomes harder to separate applause from identity. He admitted that there were periods where he wasn't sure if people valued him or the roles he played. That confusion doesn't disappear with experience. It intensifies. Because the louder the praise, the harder it is to hear truth. He referenced this directly in a Rolling Stone profile where he said that external validation is a dangerous substitute for self-understanding. That line wasn't scripted. It was reflective. It came after decades of being told who he was by critics, fans, and industries. Fame took away the freedom to be undefined. Trust was another quiet casualty. Fame taught him that information travels faster than intention. Things said casually can be weaponized. Context can be removed. Jokes can become statements. Over time, he learned to speak less, not because he had nothing to say, but because speaking carried unpredictable consequences. He admitted that this guardedness affected his personal relationships. Not everyone knew which version of him they were meeting. The public version, the professional version, or the exhausted human behind it all. Fame creates layers, and the deeper layers rarely get attention. One of the most overlooked admissions he made was about control. Fame gives the illusion of power, but removes control over interpretation. You can act, speak, clarify, and still be misunderstood at scale. He stated that the most frustrating part was realizing that truth doesn't always travel as far as narrative. This realization didn't make him bitter. It made him quieter. In interviews, his tone shifted over the years. Early confidence softened into caution. Humor remained, but it carried weight. This evolution is visible when you compare early press appearances with later long-form interviews. The contrast isn't age. It's exposure. He also acknowledged that fame changed how he processed criticism. When critique is constant and amplified, it no longer feels informative. It feels invasive. He admitted that learning to ignore noise is harder than people think, especially when that noise includes speculation about your character, intentions, and private life. Fame also removed the ability to fail privately. Mistakes that would teach most people lessons instead became public records. That pressure changes risk tolerance. It changes creativity. He admitted that there were times he played safe not because he wanted to, but because failure carried disproportionate consequences. This is where the title becomes real. When Johnny Depp finally admits what fame took from him, it isn't about one dramatic moment. It's about erosion. The slow removal of ordinary experiences. The quiet replacement of freedom with visibility. He never claimed fame ruined his life. His own words show balance. He acknowledged gratitude for opportunities, for art, for connection. But he also acknowledged loss. And both truths can exist at the same time. As he said in a documented interview, success is not the same as fulfillment. Fame can amplify your voice, but it can also drown it. After 40 years, that understanding didn't come from theory. It came from living inside a spotlight that never turns off. And as the story continues, the most revealing part isn't what fame gave him, but how much he had to give up just to survive inside it. What came next was not rebellion against fame, but adaptation. Johnny Depp has said in recorded interviews that survival in the spotlight is not about fighting attention. It's about learning how to live beside it without losing yourself completely. That lesson did not come early. It came after years of misunderstandings, pressure, and public interpretation that rarely paused to ask who he was when the cameras were gone. In a later Rolling Stone interview, Johnny Depp admitted that he began withdrawing not because he disliked people, but because fame trained him to expect intrusion. When you're observed constantly, even kindness can feel conditional. Applause can feel transactional. And over time, the nervous system adapts by pulling inward. He spoke openly about how fame complicated creativity. Acting, which once felt like exploration, started to feel like expectation. Certain roles came with assumptions. Certain choices came with risk assessments. He admitted that there were moments when he questioned whether his instincts still belonged to him or had been shaped by market response. That internal conflict doesn't show up on box office charts, but it defines long careers. Music became one of the few places where he felt unseen in the right way. In interviews discussing his work with friends and musicians, he described music as a space where attention was shared, not centralized. That distinction matters. Fame isolates. Collaboration diffuses pressure. It reminded him that expression doesn't have to be consumed to be valid. Another thing fame slowly took from him was the ability to be misunderstood without punishment. For most people, being misunderstood is temporary. For someone famous, it can be permanent. He explained that once a narrative settles publicly, correction becomes almost impossible. Even facts struggle to catch up with perception. This realization didn't make him defensive. It made him deliberate. He also admitted that fame altered how he processed pain. Grief, disappointment, and exhaustion were often expected to be managed privately while being consumed publicly. He once stated that mourning under observation creates a split experience. You grieve as a human while simultaneously performing stability for an audience. That split leaves marks. In long-form interviews, he reflected on how fame encouraged extremes. People either idealized him or dismissed him. Nuance rarely survived. He said that being reduced to symbols, either positive or negative, erases complexity. And complexity is where real identity lives. When that space disappears, you start protecting whatever remains. Fame also affected his sense of time with people he loved. Presence became fragmented. Conversations interrupted. Moments shortened. He admitted that being physically present did not always mean being mentally available, because awareness of public scrutiny never fully shut off. Even at home, the outside world lingered. One of the most honest things he said was that fame teaches you how replaceable attention is. Love from the public can shift overnight. Trends move on. Loyalty fluctuates. Once you understand this, you stop attaching your worth to applause. But that understanding often arrives after damage. He acknowledged responsibility in moments where things went wrong. His interviews never framed him as flawless. Instead, they framed him as human navigating an inhuman level of exposure. That distinction is important for credibility. Fame magnifies mistakes, but it also magnifies self-reflection when it's genuine. In discussions about legacy, he avoided grand statements. He said that fame tempts people to think in monuments, but life is lived in moments. What mattered more to him was whether he stayed curious, whether he stayed honest in his work, whether he allowed himself to evolve even when the public preferred familiarity. He also spoke about silence as a form of protection. Stepping back was not retreat, but repair. When you spend decades being interpreted, silence becomes a way to reclaim authorship. Not everything needs response. Not every accusation needs performance. Sometimes restraint is the only control left. Fame also reshaped how he viewed success. Earlier in his career, success was momentum. Later, success became alignment. Choosing projects that felt meaningful rather than loud. Choosing distance over dominance. These shifts rarely make headlines, but they reveal maturity forged under pressure. He admitted that the hardest part was forgiving himself for not knowing sooner. For believing that endurance meant strength. For thinking that pushing through exhaustion was admirable. Fame rewards visibility, not sustainability. Learning to stop felt counterintuitive. Necessary, but uncomfortable. In interviews conducted after major public scrutiny, his tone carried less defensiveness and more clarity. He didn't deny pain. He contextualized it. He recognized how fame creates an environment where people feel entitled to your inner life. Reclaiming boundaries became an act of self-respect, not secrecy. Another thing he acknowledged was how fame distorts feedback. Praise becomes loud. Criticism becomes louder. Honest guidance becomes rare. He said that the most valuable voices were often the quietest ones, the ones not invested in the public image. Learning to listen selectively became essential. He also talked about how fame interfered with learning. When people expect expertise from you, admitting confusion feels risky. Yet growth requires not knowing. He admitted there were times he avoided vulnerability because fame punished uncertainty. Breaking that pattern took time. What fame ultimately took from him was simplicity. Not comfort, not resources, but simplicity. The ability to live without layers. To exist without being contextualized. To make mistakes without explanation. These are small freedoms that feel invisible until they're gone. Yet his admissions never framed him as defeated. They framed him as aware. Awareness is not regret. It is integration. After 40 years, he didn't reject fame. He understood it. He understood its trade-offs, its illusions, and its limits. He once said that if you survive long enough in the spotlight, you realize that fame is not an identity, it's an environment. And environments require adaptation. Some people adapt by hardening. Others by disappearing. His path was quieter. More selective. More grounded. This honesty is what makes his admissions matter. They are not dramatic confessions. They are reflections shaped by lived experience. Fame gave him reach, but it took away ease. It gave him opportunity, but it complicated connection. And perhaps the most revealing truth he shared was this. Fame did not take his love for art. It tested it. Repeatedly. Surviving the test required shedding illusions, embracing limits, and redefining success on his own terms. That is what 40 years in the spotlight teaches you. Not how to shine brighter, but how to stand still without disappearing. What people often misunderstand is that acceptance does not mean peace. Johnny Depp reached a stage where he no longer fought public perception, but that did not mean it stopped affecting him. In interviews conducted over the years, he acknowledged that when your life becomes public property, emotional recovery takes longer. Wounds don't heal privately. They are reopened by reminders, headlines, and recycled narratives. He explained that fame alters memory itself. Personal moments are no longer recalled as lived experiences, but as public events. Even joy becomes archived. He once said that certain chapters of his life feel less like memories and more like footage, replayed and reframed by people who were never there. That admission reveals a deep psychological shift caused by prolonged exposure. Another thing fame took from him was the ability to grow quietly. Most people change without an audience. For him, every change was monitored, evaluated, and compared to a previous version. Growth became visible, and visibility invited judgment. He admitted that there were times he felt trapped between who he was becoming and who the public expected him to remain. He also reflected on how fame interferes with intuition. When millions of opinions surround you, your inner voice can get buried. He admitted that relearning how to trust his instincts took time. Success had trained him to listen outward. Recovery required listening inward again. There was a point he described where exhaustion stopped feeling dramatic and started feeling normal. That normalization scared him. In a documented interview, he said that constant pressure can trick you into thinking depletion is just part of the job. Realizing that this mindset was unsustainable marked a turning point. Fame also distorted the concept of accountability. Mistakes became public lessons rather than private corrections. He acknowledged that while accountability is necessary, public punishment often lacks proportion. The scale of reaction rarely matches the scale of reality. Living inside that imbalance reshapes how you relate to error and forgiveness. He spoke about how the industry rewards availability. Saying yes becomes easier than saying no. Boundaries blur. Over time, personal limits get crossed not out of malice, but out of momentum. He admitted that learning to stop felt like learning a new language. One of the more subtle losses he mentioned was curiosity. When everything you do is analyzed, exploration feels risky. Trying something new invites comparison. Yet creativity depends on curiosity. Rediscovering that curiosity required distance from noise. He also addressed the myth that experience makes exposure easier. He said the opposite can be true. The longer you are visible, the more history people project onto you. Familiarity breeds assumption. Strangers speak to you as if they know you. Correcting them feels pointless. Accepting it feels heavy. Fame also changed how he viewed justice. Public opinion often moves faster than truth. He spoke carefully about this, emphasizing patience and process. But his words made one thing clear. When narratives outrun facts, the individual inside the story becomes secondary. He admitted that there were periods where silence was misinterpreted as guilt or weakness. Yet speaking often made things worse. This paradox is unique to high visibility. The right response is not always the loudest one. Another thing Fame took was rest without explanation. Stepping away required justification. Privacy felt like absence. He said that learning to exist without constant output felt like reclaiming something basic. The right to pause. He also talked about how fame reshapes empathy. When your struggles are minimized because of success, pain becomes invisible. He admitted that people often assume resources cancel suffering. That assumption creates distance. In later interviews, his reflections carried less urgency and more acceptance. Not resignation, but clarity. He understood that fame is not a contract you renegotiate easily. It is an environment you learn to navigate with intention. He acknowledged gratitude without denying cost. Both can coexist. Opportunity does not erase pressure. Success does not cancel sacrifice. This balanced honesty is what gives his words credibility. One of his most grounded realizations was that legacy is not controlled by popularity. It is shaped by consistency. How you treat people. How you handle pressure. How you evolve when attention fades or intensifies. He also spoke about how fame distorts feedback loops. Applause can delay self-correction. Criticism can distort self-image. Learning which voices matter becomes a survival skill. He admitted that for a long time, he confused endurance with strength. Staying visible through exhaustion felt admirable. Later, he understood that longevity requires self-preservation. What fame ultimately demanded was adaptation without losing core values. That balance is rare. Many lose one to protect the other. His admissions suggest he spent years learning where to bend and where to hold firm. He did not frame himself as a victim of fame. He framed himself as a participant who learned late what the cost would be. That distinction matters. It removes drama and adds responsibility. He once said that if he could speak to his younger self, he would not warn him about fame itself, but about forgetting to protect silence. Silence is not emptiness. It is where meaning settles. This is what 40 years revealed. Fame amplifies everything except peace. Peace has to be built deliberately, away from applause. And when he finally admitted what fame took from him, it wasn't said with anger. It was said with understanding. Because only someone who lived inside it long enough can describe its true price without exaggeration. If this story made you pause, don't scroll past it. Fame is often sold as a dream, but understanding its real cost changes how we see success, celebrities, and even our own goals. If you value honest storytelling backed by real interviews, documented words, and human truth, stay connected. Share this with someone who still believes attention equals happiness. And if you want more deep, respectful narratives like this one about Johnny Depp and others who lived behind the spotlight, support the channel. Your attention helps real stories survive in a noisy world.